Good morning. You are the brave ones that got out of bed. Uh, Thank you for being with us and thanks for joining us online. It's good to be back here in such different circumstances. I think the last time I was here, the place was full. But today is a dark and rainy day and things have changed. I want to thank Amy always for the invitation and for you all for receiving us. I don't think it's luck. I think I come for a good meal too, right? In good company. Um, I wanted to kind of check in with everybody. We have been in times of great change. The last 2 years have caused us all to adapt. The technology here and the masks we're all wearing are evidence of that. Context has changed. The ways that we have to work are changed. The issues that we've been working on have been changing. So I think the first piece that I wanted to share with you all is the reminding you all what Crystal Sal is. Amy gave us a quick introduction, but we're a human rights organization that was founded by Episcopalians. It's why we make the effort to continue to come back to Episcopal communities and talk about our work and share the stories because you're all a part of it. We're an organization who has a mandate to walk with, to accompany people who are victims of violence and human rights violations. We've built programs to try and help people rebuild their lives, reintegrate into their communities if they've been displaced by violence. And ultimately, we work with people to access justice for reparations. We try and work in the societies where we serve so that those actions are not repeated. This is one of the sort of the mantras in human rights work is truth, justice, reparations, and reconciliation. And those are kind of the facets, the moments that we try and accompany people who have suffered grave crimes, atrocities, been the victims of structural discrimination and violence, as we seek to try and build a more humane world, a world where human dignity and equality is at the core of our commitments to each other, whether they're in constitutions, whether they're in our baptismal vows. These things are important. And I wanted to mention that because part of the great changes that have been unfolding around the world, but specifically in Central America, have to do with those types of core commitments, whether it be constitutional democracy or even in the lives of the church. Sometimes we feel that our core values, I lost the word in English, nuestros pactos, our covenants are tested as times change. And in El Salvador, Guatemala, and Honduras, where Crystal Sal serves, as in many parts of the world, the pandemic has accelerated not only the cost of human life in the global pandemic, the economic blowback of all of the measures to try and contain the virus, but it's also been a vehicle in which certain trends towards increasing authoritarianism in the societies were accelerated. The people put faith in their governments, accepted restrictions on their rights, on their freedoms in order to keep each other safe. They put faith in their government so that they could access resources to respond to the virus. And in the case of these three countries where we work, the result of that has been very disappointing for most people. The governments have stolen funds. They've used those powers to consolidate and concentrate their power and to dismantle the democratic institutions that were put in place at the period of war in Central America. So sadly, as a consequence of the pandemic, or I don't know if it's only to blame the pandemic, but in the pandemic, one of the outcomes has been, specifically in El Salvador, to witness the end of democratic governance in the country. A series of actions, a democratically elected president who used his democratic power to dismantle democracy and to concentrate his control. There's an interesting Netflix series, if you want to go deeper into it, called The Tyrant's Playbook. Apparently, there's nothing new under the sun when it comes to exercising power, and the steps the governments in Central America take seem to be very consistent with steps across history that different autocratic rulers have taken. First, using like I said, the democratic power to take over the legislature, then the courts, then you control the media and the communications, then the military, then the police, the attorney general, and sooner or later, all power is controlled by one person. And this is where we are in El Salvador. And that's made our work interesting as a human rights organization because Crystal Sal has been in some ways at the center of response, walking with people who have been directly affected, not only by the virus, but also by these democratic setbacks. And an increasing diversity of people have looked to our organization for help. It's interesting today, we represent magistrates who were purged illegally from the courts. We represent families of medical personnel who died during a period of time where funds were stolen to provide basic protective equipment. We work with people who were returned to the Central American countries during the lockdowns, deported back from the United States and Mexico and had no place to go. We work with LGBTQ people who continue to suffer violence and discrimination, or even during the lockdowns, were no longer able to have income. So we've had to adapt, we've had to respond to an increasingly diverse set of people who have become victims of violence or now increasingly state persecution. And one of the things in that dictator's playbook is that usually once you control all the power, then you want to change the rules. So in El Salvador, the president has proposed a new constitution. And we decided as a human rights organization, obviously, we needed to try and help people understand what that would mean, what the implications for a new constitution in El Salvador would do. And so we created a program of democratic dialogues where we went out and we organized groups just to talk to each other. First, we started with women's groups, then we worked with environmentalists, LGBT community, and now we're in dialogues with just local communities, people. And one of the things in the dialogue that we have to be able to describe to people is constitutional law. And there's a phrase in Salvadoran constitutional legal theory that's called la cláusulas pétreas. Cláusulas pétreas literally means what are the bedrock clauses of our constitution. And in Salvadoran constitutional law, those are the only things in the constitution that just can't be changed. Because if we change those things, you change the form of the government. You change the covenant, you change the agreement. And in El Salvador specifically, la cláusulas pétreas were set up to be able to stop specifically the historic pattern of military dictatorship in the country. So they're very specific things to try and protect democratic system of government from authoritarians. And so naturally, when you move those things, you make a huge impact on the system of government in El Salvador. And it's an interesting concept to talk about with people. It was in a conversation recently with a friend, an activist from Sudan, who, if you remember, earlier last year had its own revolution where they brought down an authoritarian. And he said to me that in times of revolution, there's an explosion of civic education in the streets. And it's an interesting concept because, or a sad one in some ways, because why do we have to wait until it's gone in order for us to be aware of what we had? These things that seem abstract, like separation of powers or independent judiciaries, these principles, these institutions in our democracies are there to protect lives. to protect freedoms. And then when they're gone, only then do we realize how important these abstractions were. And those are the essence of the clausulas pétreas, those bedrock elements of our agreements, of our covenants with each other. And I was thinking about that in the light of the church, or in the life of the church, as we as church communities adapt to changing contexts, to uncertainty. Even people whisper that the churches as institutions aren't as relevant in society anymore. Becoming aware before it's too late of those clausulas pétreas, the bedrock core of our agreements, seems like an urgent task, because those are fundamentally the things that if we change, it changes the nature of our communities, changes the nature of our social compacts. In the church, for example, it occurs to me that the golden rule is one of the things that in our societies that comes out of the gospel tradition that still nobody questions. This idea that you should love your neighbor, we're not very good at respecting it all the time, but still nobody's saying that that's not true. What if those things got turned on their head and people stopped saying that, stopped believing in those clausulas pétreas, those bedrock things that govern the way that we live with each other? And I know I'm making kind of a big jump between democratic governance, authoritarianism, and the mission and the life of the church and societies. But I think as institutions change and adapt in these dynamic times, even some people might feel like they're dark times, an increased awareness of the things that are core to who we are as a community are the things that must be defended. You know, when those things are attacked, those things must be protected. Or our commitments, our covenant with each other falls to the wayside. And the things that we thought that would protect us, our freedoms, our lives, will all of a sudden could be gone. That's one of the frightening things that we're learning in these early stages of authoritarianism in El Salvador. That if you hope to have a impartial trial, if you hope to be able to have access to information, you hope to be able to speak freely, there are no institutions anymore that will protect that right. And that makes our work as a human rights organization increasingly important. They look to us now in the absence of other institutions to walk with them as they continue to embody and manifest those bedrock values, those bedrock commitments that we think are the core of peace and security in our human family. And that is what human rights are. I wanted to share that story with you all, not to depress you, but because I think that this is a critical moment where we build a greater awareness about our covenants to each other, a greater awareness about the term that we use, solidarity. Solidarity meaning that we increasingly see the struggle for my rights and freedom as interconnected and interdependent with the struggle and rights and freedoms of all people. So I want to close with just one more story that I think illustrates that. The last time I was here in person, at least, I mentioned Cristosal's work to prosecute a war crime in El Salvador. We're the lead prosecution on one of the largest massacre cases to have been perpetrated on the American continent in modern times. It's called the El Mozote Massacre. We've been prosecuting this trial for 6 years. And we've won multiple appeals processes. We're about 85% done with the trial. It'll be the first time in El Salvador that a crime against humanity has ever been brought forward, that anybody from the high level of the government has ever been held accountable for some of the worst atrocities committed in modern times on our continent. Unfortunately, in the context of the increasingly authoritarian governments and the purges of the justice system, the judge in charge of the El Mozote massacre was purged from his post. When we as an organization decided we're preparing for this, we knew this was coming, we did begin to do a massive communication campaign television spots, radio spots, to raise the visibility of the trial and the consequences of this illegal purge of judges on the access of justice for thousands of victims of crimes against humanity. And in response, the President of the Supreme Court offered to the judge in the El Mozote case the opportunity to stay on. He said he would make an exception in the case of this judge. He could continue to preside over the trial, and then when he was done, he would have to leave. It was a face-saving effort. And the judge, when he talked to us, he said, there's no dignity in that. In an act of solidarity with the rest of the judges, hundreds of judges who were being purged, he said he wouldn't accept that deal. He said he wouldn't be an accomplice to the dismantling of the democratic system of governance and to the independent judiciary. And when we explained that position to the victims, the survivors of the massacre, they thought about it briefly, and then they said that they supported the judge's decision, even though that meant the effective political end to the trial. And they made a press statement, and there was a phrase in the press statement that just, it struck me. They said that, and we're talking about the survivors and victims of one of the worst atrocities committed. I've said this multiple times now. These are people who owe nothing to anybody. And they said that after 40 years of struggling for justice, we now see that the actions taken against the judge in our case bring us to solidarity with the victims of all victims of violence in El Salvador, thousands of victims of violence who now have their access of justice interrupted. They said that we see our access of justice as interconnected and interdependent on the access of all people to justice. In an act of solidarity, they supported the judge in his actions, and in doing so, supported all victims of violence. It's an interesting moment where we all have many legitimate causes, but when we're aware of those clausulas petres, the bedrock of our social compacts, of our covenants with each other, we're able to see our causes, our rights, as deeply interconnected with those of others. In an act of selflessness, the victims of the El Mozote massacre give us a lesson in solidarity that I wanted to share with you all today. So it's good to be with you on a rainy day. It's good to check in with this community. We'll have a forum in between the services at 11:30. En el nombre del Padre, del Hijo y del Espíritu Santo. Amén.